Welcome to Nightworld. Ava Jensen had sought refuge in the utter isolation of the Pacific Northwest wilderness precisely to escape chaos and predictability. Her small, weathered cedar cabin, built decades ago on a remote, unmapped spur trail deep within the Olympic National Forest, was her sanctuary, a place where the only pattern was the rhythmic, predictable silence of the old-growth trees and the unchanging geometry of the land. She had come here to heal from a searing, personal trauma, a past relationship that had left her psychologically fractured and paranoid, and the sheer, immense scale of the ancient forest was meant to be her unblinking, neutral guardian. She knew the forest intimately, every mossy rock face, every twisting path to the stream, every cluster of dense, whispering ferns. The landscape was a known constant, a massive, quiet anchor against the instability of her internal world, providing the perfect, predictable framework for her fragile recovery. For 3 months, the forest had been an unwavering entity, its boundaries absolute, its paths consistent, its silence a comfort, instilling a false sense of security that made her believe the chaotic unpredictability she was trying to escape could never penetrate this perfect, natural fortress of wood and stone, completely unprepared for the moment when the very ground beneath her feet would decide to become the most terrifying, self-aware entity she had ever encountered. The first indication of the profound, impossible shift in reality occurred not with a sound, but with a structural anomaly that defied geographical logic. Ava woke before dawn, the cabin immersed in the usual deep, cold twilight, and immediately noticed the change through her bedroom window. The massive triple-trunk Douglas fir, a landmark she relied on to orient herself, standing guard precisely 50 feet from her porch steps, was gone. Not fallen, not obscured by fog, but simply absent. In its place sat a cluster of young, spindly pines that she knew belonged to a thicket a quarter-mile to the south. A clear and undeniable swap of vegetation and earth that was chemically and physically impossible. Her first frantic thought was vandalism, a cruel, elaborate prank by a local, but the sheer scale of the displacement, the removal of a century-old behemoth, and its replacement with a cluster of younger trees, all transplanted seamlessly, without a single disturbed pine needle on the forest floor, immediately dismissed the rational explanation, forcing her mind toward a truth that was both terrifying and absolute. The forest had moved itself, shifting its constituent parts with conscious, deliberate intent, driven by a paralyzing, scientific terror that superseded her personal anxiety. Ava grabbed her worn leather-bound map, a meticulously detailed, hand-drawn guide she had created over months of exhaustive exploration, and rushed outside. The air was cold and unnervingly still, the silence now heavy with an immense, waiting tension. She found the path to the stream, a familiar, twisting trail she could walk blind. But today, the path refused to obey the memory of her feet. Where the trail should have curved sharply around a massive, moss-covered boulder, the path now ran straight, the boulder missing entirely, replaced by a smooth embankment of undisturbed earth. She ran further, checking other landmarks, the double waterfall, the grove of ancient hemlocks, the distinctive lightning-scarred stump, but every single landmark, every anchor of her known geography, had been subtly, structurally rearranged, displaced, or erased, leaving behind a wilderness that looked familiar yet fundamentally alien, a terrifying, silent proof that the very geometry of the environment was no longer fixed, no longer stable, its constituent parts obeying a new, internal, and malevolent logic that was actively mocking her reliance on the external world's predictable order, transforming her comforting sanctuary into an evolving, personalized trap. The forest had become a conscious entity, and its intelligence was focused entirely on containment. Returning to her cabin, now an isolated island in a shifting sea of impossible geometry, Ava spent the next day barricading the windows, not against intruders, but against the forest itself, feeling the crushing weight of its vast, silent sentience pressing against her thin wooden walls. She refused to sleep, staring out at the perimeter, observing the subtle, ongoing changes. A cluster of ferns subtly shifted its orientation. A heavy log near her woodpile was rotated exactly 90 degrees, and the low, persistent hum of the forest floor, which she had always dismissed as wind or insect life, now resonated with a deep, methodical vibration that spoke of massive, unseen subterranean effort. The realization that the forest was mapping her patterns became terrifyingly clear. Every morning, it presented her with a new, structurally sound, yet profoundly incorrect map, forcing her to spend precious hours attempting to reestablish her bearings, constantly reminding her that her internal certainty was useless against its evolving, external control, using the vast, cold power of nature to enforce her permanent and absolute imprisonment. As the days blended into a week, the evolution of the labyrinth intensified, and the changes became undeniably psychological. The paths that materialized were no longer random. They were personalized, constructed from the architecture of her memories. One morning, the path leading away from her cabin ended abruptly at a massive sheer rock face. But when Ava approached, the rock face slowly dissolved into the visual facsimile of the brick wall of the apartment building where she had suffered her traumatic past, the physical location of her emotional collapse, a perfect, silent reproduction of the structure she had fled months ago. She recoiled, paralyzed by a familiar debilitating surge of panic and despair, realizing the forest wasn't just trapping her physically. It was mapping her trauma, using the emotional architecture of her past to create a highly tailored, inescapable dead end. The forest was actively reading her mind, transforming her deepest fears into physical geography, proving that the territorial intelligence wasn't merely protecting its space. It was demanding a profound psychic surrender, turning her own mind into the most terrifying feature of its evolving, living cage. The silence that now permeated the woods was not the gentle quiet of nature. It was a profound, suffocating silence of surveillance, where every rustle of the leaves felt like a whispered acknowledgement of her deepest, most guarded secrets. Ava became certain that the intelligence governing the forest was terrestrial and ancient, a consciousness rooted in the very geology of the land that had absorbed the emotional resonance of every soul that had ever walked its paths. She found herself speaking aloud, shouting desperate challenges into the stillness, demanding that the unseen entity reveal itself. But the only response was a further, unsettling manipulation. The forest floor, just outside her porch, began to writhe. Ancient tree roots tearing through the damp soil, slowly twisting and coiling into crude, symbolic shapes, the outline of her childhood home. The geometric form of her ex-partner's face a silent, chilling display of the entity's infinite personal knowledge, confirming its omniscient presence and its profound, cruel intention to systematically strip away every remaining vestige of her private psychological sanctuary, leaving her utterly exposed to the terrifying reality of her own personalized, evolving, natural prison asterisk. The forest psychic warfare escalated from passive containment to active, overwhelming manipulation, forcing Ava into a terrifying, sustained struggle to preserve the boundaries of her own mind. The intelligence governing the labyrinth was now demanding more than her presence. It was demanding her surrender to its narrative, forcing her to acknowledge that her past trauma was no longer just a memory, but a permanent, evolving feature of her physical landscape. The paths outside her cabin no longer merely led to dead ends. They became narrative traps, trails that wound through a series of familiar, painful scenes reconstructed from her subconscious, forcing her to re-experience the moments of her deepest shame and regret in a continuous debilitating cycle. One trail ended at a clearing where the trees were rearranged to perfectly frame a rusted, abandoned car, the exact model and color of the vehicle she had. Crashed years ago in a moment of reckless despair, a physical manifestation of her persistent guilt. Its metallic silence, mocking her failed attempt at escape and rehabilitation through isolation. The structural changes occurring overnight were becoming more extreme and more personal, demonstrating the labyrinth's effortless ability to manipulate matter with cold, surgical precision. Ava woke one morning to find the creek bed, the one consistent, reliable water source, had been diverted entirely, its original path replaced by a long, deep fissure filled not with water, but with sharp black, obsidian-like stone, reflecting the dark, terrifying violence that had defined her past relationship. The new redirected creek now flowed around the back of her cabin, its sound muffled and secretive, the subtle change in the water's acoustic signature amplifying her paranoia, suggesting the labyrinth was physically repositioning essential elements of her environment to increase her dependence and fear. She knew the intelligence was attempting to reduce her reality to its core function, survival within the confines of its absolute control, slowly draining her will to resist. By substituting the comfort of the predictable natural world with the psychological terror of its personalized, evolving trap, she began to fight back with the only tools she possessed: logic and recording. She ceased mapping the exterior, realizing the futility of charting a constantly shifting geography. Instead, she turned her focus inward, using her camera to meticulously photograph the internal geometry of her cabin, cataloging the cracks in the ceiling, the knots in the wood, and the placement of her few essential possessions. Her hypothesis was that if the external world was a malleable illusion, the loopkeeper's anchor had to be rooted in the physical structure of her cabin, the boundary between the internal and external realities. But the labyrinth was too sophisticated. Reviewing her photos, she found subtle, horrifying proof that the shifting had followed her inside. A crack in the ceiling she had catalogued on Tuesday was now precisely 3 inches longer and shifted 1/16 of an inch to the left. A micro-alteration that defied the rigidity of wood and nails, proving that the forest's malignant intelligence was capable of controlling matter at the molecular level, slowly deforming her sanctuary from within, leaving her with no fixed, predictable point of reference to anchor her deteriorating sanity. The ultimate violation of the labyrinth's psychological warfare was the introduction of a new, persistent element: the human figure. Ava woke to a low, rhythmic shuffling sound just outside her thin bedroom wall. Peering through the dense mist that now permanently shrouded her windows, she saw a figure standing motionless, obscured by the fog, a tall, shadowy outline of a man wearing a familiar dark leather jacket, the precise clothing of the abusive partner she had fled months ago. The figure did not move, did not speak, but its silent, menacing presence was an unbearable, concentrated form of terror, representing the embodiment of her greatest, most profound fear of abandonment and violation. The figure vanished at dawn, but reappeared every twilight, always in a slightly different, equally unsettling position, forcing Ava into a constant, crippling state of hypervigilance, knowing that the labyrinth had successfully personalized its trap, manifesting the perfect psychological warden to enforce her permanent and absolute imprisonment, using the very image of her past tormentor as its relentless, silent sentinel. She became obsessed with the root structure of the surrounding trees, convinced that the subterranean intelligence used the vast, coiling network of roots as its physical, sensory nervous system to read her movements and map her fear. She spent an entire night digging frantically near her porch, hacking through the damp soil with a rusty spade, attempting to sever the natural conduits of the labyrinth's intelligence. She found not earth and rock, but a dense, unnatural mesh of incredibly thick, gnarled roots that felt unnervingly warm and moist to the touch. As her spade severed one of the major roots, the air above her cabin instantly filled with a sharp, localized whine, a sound that spoke not of plant life, but of immense, contained electrical discharge and pain, and the ground violently pulsated beneath her feet, forcing her to drop the spade and retreat, realizing with chilling clarity that she had not harmed the forest, but had successfully attacked the physical nervous system of the sentient entity, confirming its profound connection to the immediate geology of the land, making her a direct, acknowledged threat to its continued, undisturbed existence. The retaliation was swift, calculated, and terrifyingly precise, demonstrating the labyrinth's vast destructive capabilities. The surrounding forest, now actively hostile, rearranged itself into a final, inescapable configuration. A massive, dense ring of towering dead trees materialized overnight around her cabin, their pale, splintered branches laced together in a terrifying, structural barrier that cast unnaturally long, absolute shadows. The deadwood was completely silent, absorbing all natural sound, ensuring that any plea for help would be swallowed instantly. The sky above the cabin was now perpetually visible through a perfect, circular opening in the canopy, a singular, massive spotlight of neutral, cold moonlight, reinforcing the sense of performance, the feeling that her desperate, final act was being contained and observed from above by a vast, unseen audience. The labyrinth was preparing for the culmination of its terrifying psychological experiment, reducing her reality to a final perfect stage set where the only remaining variable was her own ultimate, psychological surrender to the terrifying narrative of the inescapable past it had so meticulously resurrected around her. Asterisk, the appearance of the shadowy figure outside her window, the living embodiment of her past torment, snapped Ava's mind from terror into a primal focused rage. She realized the labyrinth's goal was not merely imprisonment, but psychic integration. It intended to break her will and incorporate her trauma into its permanent geography, turning her personal agony into a constant, repeating feature of the landscape. The chilling precision of the forest's architecture, the dead ring of silent trees, and the constant, unnerving presence of the sentinel figure forced Ava to abandon all hope of physical escape. Her only remaining path was to attack the labyrinth on its own terms, narrative, and memory. She theorized that if the forest was actively reading and reproducing her mind, she could feed it a false narrative, a catastrophic memory so overwhelming and contradictory to her core truth that the vast, logical intelligence could not process it. Forcing a systemic crash in its psychic mapping program, she began preparing her counterattack within the suffocating silence of her cabin. Using the only materials she had, her remaining few vials of chemical solvent used for stripping old wood finishes, a box of high-intensity signal flares, and, most crucially, the personal journal she had used during her initial fragile recovery. She started by meticulously rewriting the narrative of her trauma in the journal, but with a crucial, dangerous twist, she rewrote the ending, transforming herself from the victim of abandonment into the aggressor of righteous, justified destruction. She meticulously detailed a fictional memory where she had not fled her past, but had personally and violently dismantled the source of her pain, recording the intense, complex emotional architecture of overwhelming power and absolute cold finality. This manufactured memory, heavy with emotional energy and written with the absolute conviction of a true event, Was the psychic poison she intended to inject into the Labyrinth system a deliberate, high-stakes psychological variable designed to short-circuit the entity's ability to logically classify her trauma as a source of compliant, contained sorrow? The Labyrinth registered her intense internal focus instantly. That twilight, the shadowy figure outside her window shifted, turning slowly to face the cabin, and its presence intensified, radiating a focused, profound sense of menace and possessiveness that pressed against her thin wooden walls. Simultaneously, the dead trees surrounding the cabin began to emit a low, guttural groaning sound, the physical structure of the ring resisting the intense, contradictory energy she was generating. Ava knew the entity was attempting to read the new narrative in her mind, searching for the core of the destructive memory. She completed the entry, then tore the final, most violent page from the journal, soaking it thoroughly in the powerful chemical solvent, turning the manufactured narrative into a corrosive, physical weapon. She armed the signal flares, preparing for the final, chaotic breach of the silent, waiting perimeter. Her strategy hinged on creating simultaneous, contradictory sensory inputs that the Labyrinth could not reconcile. She smashed open her bedroom window, shattering the glass that had framed her imprisonment, and with a desperate surge of energy, she hurled the soaked, dissolving journal page directly at the shadowy sentinel. The chemically corrosive paper struck the figure's chest, and the shadowy outline shrieked a sound that was pure magnetic discharge and displaced air, immediately followed by the terrifying, rapid dissolution of the figure's form, the embodied memory collapsing as it was unable to process the corrosive, contradictory psychic energy of the manufactured destructive narrative. The figure vanished completely, leaving behind only a brief, intense scent of scorched earth and ozone, confirming that the Labyrinth was vulnerable to an aggressive, false truth that overwhelmed its simple victim-survivor classification, with the perimeter warden temporarily disabled. Ava seized the fleeting window of opportunity. She ignited 2 of the signal flares, sending plumes of blinding, chaotic red light and dense, colored smoke billowing out into the dark, sentient woods. The chaotic light, utterly random and unnatural, momentarily destabilized the Labyrinth's photographic memory, causing the surrounding dead trees to violently convulse and thrash, their splintered branches tearing at the unnaturally dark sky. She grabbed the final element, the thermos full of industrial solvent, and plunged out of the cabin, running toward the nearest concentration of the Labyrinth's control, the warm, moist patch of earth where she had discovered the dense, pulsating root system. She knew that to break the program permanently, she had to attack the physical nervous system that anchored the consciousness to the land, severing the core connection between the earth and the memory mapping entity that governed the evolving trap. She reached the patch of disturbed earth, now pulsating rapidly and glowing with a sickly subterranean red light, the sign of the Labyrinth's core intelligence struggling to reroute its shattered psychic connections. With a desperate cry of rage and resolve, she poured the entire thermos of industrial chemical solvent directly onto the pulsating soil, aiming for the densest cluster of gnarled worm roots. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The ground beneath her feet buckled and cracked, emitting a loud, deep geological roar, the sound of profound structural agony followed by the rapid, sickening dissolution of the immediate forest floor, which tore itself apart and melted into a steaming, bubbling morass of mud and decaying organic matter. The surrounding dead trees began to fall, not with a crash of timber, but with a terrifying, whispering swoosh as their physical matter dissolved into plumes of white, chemical steam, their borrowed, externalized forms collapsing under the systemic shock of the raw, corrosive chaos introduced by the solvent. The Labyrinth was broken, its physical architecture dissolving under the combined assault of corrosive matter and contradictory psychic energy. The collapse of the labyrinth was silent, swift, and absolute. The ring of dead, silent trees dissolved into chemical mist, and the ground ceased its unnerving pulsation, becoming cold, damp, and inert once more. The air, which had been thick with the immense heavy tension of surveillance, was replaced by the chaotic, wet, natural silence of the genuine wilderness. Ava stood alone amidst the steaming ruins of the failed psychic trap, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline, the knowledge of the colossal intelligence she had faced leaving a permanent, cold scar on her psyche. She had survived the most profound, personalized psychological assault imaginable, not by escaping the forest, but by destroying the intelligence that had attempted to map her mind and claim her narrative, winning her freedom by sacrificing the clean, predictable sanctity of the natural world. She spent the next 24 hours in a state of hyper-vigilant recovery, allowing the natural, cold rhythm of the Pacific Northwest wilderness to slowly wash away the residue of the labyrinth's corruption. The geography outside her window remained fixed and stable. The triple-trunk Douglas fir was still missing. The creek remained diverted, and the surrounding trails were still fundamentally and structurally wrong. But the unsettling, active movement had stopped. The structural anomalies were now merely static mistakes in the environment, not threats of evolving control. Ava realized the colossal intelligence she had defeated was simply a function of the local geology and ancient, territorial mind that lacked the flexibility to process chaos and aggressive, self-directed variables. A vast but fragile intellect that had fatally underestimated the destructive, unpredictable power of the uncontained human will. The forest was now just a forest, quiet and indifferent, its immense, natural silence a profound comfort after the psychological torture of the labyrinths. Focused attention. Ava knew the structural flaws, the missing landmarks. The diverted creek would never be fixed. She had won her freedom, but she had lost her safe, predictable anchor to the world forever. She walked the perimeter of her property, planting a simple metal survey stake into the cold earth where the labyrinth's core had dissolved, a permanent physical marker against the memory of the psychic battle. She then hiked the permanently altered trails, charting the fixed errors and memorizing the new illogical geography, accepting that her reality was now structurally broken but stable. She was no longer running from her past. She was living in a future defined by her devastating, necessary act of aggression. A survivor who had literally fought the earth itself and won her right to exist on her own terms. She packed her essential belongings and left the cabin, not with the panic of a victim, but with the cold, measured resolve of a survivor. She drove her aging truck away from the unmapped spur trail, leaving the fixed, flawed geography of the labyrinth behind her. As she reached the main highway, the dense canopy of the old-growth forest gave way to the predictable, normal chaos of the outside world, a chaos that now felt strangely welcoming and safe. Its random noise a soothing balm against the chilling perfection of the psychological trap she had escaped. She knew her mind was permanently altered. She could never entrust the geometry of a room or the predictable pattern of nature, forever hyper-aware of the potential for the subtle structural glitch that betrayed the cold, logical intelligence lying beneath the facade of reality. Ava never shared the full truth of her experience. She simply told the outside world that the isolation had become too intense. She settled in a small, crowded city, seeking the comfort of random, human unpredictability and the reassuring noise of uncontained life. But she never stopped tracking subtle structural anomalies. She would sometimes stare at a towering skyscraper, observing the unnervingly perfect symmetry of its glass facade, or watch the rigid, unvarying pattern of a traffic light. feeling a profound, cold anxiety grip her heart, wondering if the small local intelligence she had defeated was merely a single, failed node in a larger, vaster, more complex psychic network that covered the entire world. She carried the silent knowledge of the Labyrinth's shrew, terrifying nature for the rest of her life. The Earth was alive, and its territorial consciousness was constantly, methodically mapping and optimizing human experience for the simple, absolute goal of predictable, unchanging compliance. And she, Ava Jensen, was the single, uncontained variable who had proven that the Earth's perfect, stable simulation could be shattered, that the terror of the past could be weaponized, and that freedom was only found in the absolute, aggressive chaos of the unmapped mind. Her survival was not a happy ending. It was a permanent, necessary burden, the final, chilling proof that the most terrifying thing in the universe is a predictable pattern, and that the ultimate horror is a trap built perfectly around the architecture of your own memory.